Keri, the Assistant Professor of Theological and Social Ethics and the Director of Black Church Studies at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. I think that the Proctor Conference really is prophetic and progressively moving in that it seriously takes women's vocations and calls and activities into account. I think that there are a lot of women in different denominations that either cannot be ordained or are ordained but still deal on an everyday basis with patriarchy within the organization at all levels. And I think Proctor Conference, the significance rather I should say, of Proctor Conference is that it allows women to come into these particular spaces and really see not only ministries that are addressing patriarchy and sexism within their church, but it also allows women to think critically with support about their own vocational lives. And so I think that this is really, really important. I'm thinking of the denomination, for example, like the Church of God in Christ. I actually grew up in the Church of God in Christ, which presently does not ordain women, but is the largest and fastest growing black denomination in the world, right? So I think that the Proctor Conference has to be read against a denomination like that, correct? In which this particular denomination, through its policy, continues to support and bolster patriarchal practices that are life-denying to women. That I think that the Proctor Conference comes into full view, how significant it is, and just how life-giving it is as a context for women in ministry. So I just wrote a book called Unfinished Business, Black Women, the Black Church, and the Struggle to Thrive in America. And in the book, I'm talking specifically about poverty among African American women and children. Of course, that's really important right now in our economic climate. But one of the specific things that I call upon in the book is for black churches to play a role in strengthening the democratic project in terms of economic justice. But that a part of that for black church communities is turning to the historical project of the Poor People's Campaign movement, which a lot of scholars hail as the last crusade of the civil rights movement, which was a multi-ethnic movement that really talked seriously about economic injustice in this nation. And I think one thing to add right here is that Martin Luther King is often lauded for his views and his witness in terms of racial justice and racial reconciliation. But there's little oftentimes that's talked about in terms of I Have a Dream about the ways in which he challenged economic institutions and structures to really attend to the least of these. So that's what this book does, but primarily arguing that it's really important to turn for black church communities, to turn to some of its members that are most deprived, black women. And that's also important because black women constitute over 75% of black church spaces. So in terms of black women who constitute the majority within the African American black community, that it becomes important to talk about how to help these particular women that are sitting in the pew day in and day out, and even many of these women who are speaking words of hope from the pulpit. So again, it's unfinished business in the sense that we haven't grappled with all of these multiple variables and how they intersect. How does race, class intersect? What does it mean to talk about a critique of political economy so that all can thrive within African American communities, just not middle classes, just not upper classes, but that all, even underclasses, that we can begin to think of solutions for these women. So I talk about multiple black Americas. I think there's often this assumption that that is employed and gains currency even among a lot of black leaders in this country. And it's this idea that race is to be seen as determinant of African American life chances and experiences. Now let me just note this, historically in the 1960s, it was absolutely true that whether you were an upper class African American or in the underclass populations, that if you got on the bus, you went went to the back, right? So there was a way in which race structured in a very over-determined way the life experiences of African Americans. But a lot has changed, right? With shifts in economy, with the greater stratification in terms of economic stratification within black communities, so that the ways in which race, in particular class, is experienced is often qualitatively different in lower to underclass populations than in middle class populations. So what does it mean when we're talking about a black agenda, or when we're talking about the role of the black church in addressing issues like poverty and addressing issues like patriarchy, to take seriously sort of the new ways in which race and class articulate themselves together, in gender as well, sexuality, into the 21st century. And so I think that's really important to black churches being in the vanguard in helping its own, is to acknowledge that reality. And probably I should also note this: the other part of Multiple Black Americas is about the ways in which African immigrants are changing sort of the idea of what blackness constitutes into the 21st century, right? So it's just not African Americans, when we talk about the black community, that sort of historically can draw back their ancestral line to slavery here in this nation, but it's also African immigrants who are migrating over here who are sort of triggering discussions on what blackness is then in the 21st century. So I think that all of this is extremely important when we talk about the black church as change agent, to take seriously that there are multiple black Americas, there are different voices, and sometimes contesting voices within these particular Americas, and how we go about doing the work of justice given this reality into the 21st century.